Hey folks, Nathan P. Butler here. This is another of our content overview videos, this time taking a look at Heroes of the Sanctum, the strategy card game from FireTap Games. This is the material from the first Kickstarter for the game. There's a second one already on the way as of the time that I am recording this in October 2024. And this is a rare instance of a Kickstarter that actually delivered not only on time, but early. They funded back in April of 2024 with a delivery target of October 2024, and my copy at least arrived in September 2024. So they managed to get this thing completely turned around, out the door, and shipped to backers in a very short period of time. Probably because, in part, they weren't using a fulfillment center, they used Ship from China, SFC, as it's often called. This is a relatively small game in terms of how compact it all is, though I will say having some type of unified storage box would not go amiss in a second Kickstarter, but if they're going to keep releasing stuff, they might need to wait a while until they eventually do have some type of storage box. So right now, we have these four products to take a look at. We have the base game, we have the multiplayer expansion, the epic expansion, and the comic campaign. And this is a game that is initially designed primarily for solo play, but then there are multiplayer ways to play it. I would note that even if you're only playing solo, it is worth it for the multiplayer expansion, as we will take a look at. So assuming you were not a retailer, the primary pledge levels that you could get would be just the base game as an early bird pledge for £21, or $24 if it was not the early bird. The ultimate bundle of all of it for £59, or a version that still gave you all of this, but also gave you a custom hero based on your own likeness, just for you, not in all copies of the game, for £199. Now, I was lucky. I had seen this thing advertised constantly on Facebook and elsewhere, so I'd been following it quite a bit and was very interested in it. So when it finally came up on Kickstarter, I jumped on it and backed it immediately. Turns out that made me backer number one, and because this is their first game, that also made me the first backer for the company as a whole. So they decided to say thank you by upgrading me from the Ultimate Pledge to that Custom Pledge, so we will see here actually what a custom character looks like if you were to have gotten that level of the Kickstarter. I wasn't intending to go that route, though I was considering it, but they graciously provided it as a thanks for being their first ever backer. I would note, though, that just because you could buy it all together didn't mean you necessarily had to buy it all together. In theory, you could have done it kind of piecemeal and got the comic campaign book over here for $23. This is putting it in US dollars because that's the way it shows it on my screen here. Or $27 for the multiplayer expansion, or $27 also for the epic expansion. So $27, $27, $23. The base game for $21 or $24, depending on if it was early bird. So a solid bit of savings if you bought the Ultimate. So normally when looking at a game like this, we'd be talking a lot about stretch goals, but there really weren't many for this game. Their funding goal was £5,400. They raised £33,050. There was one social stretch goal, but otherwise the stretch goals weren't about adding new content so much as improving the quality of what was already there. At £10,000, they upped the card thickness to 300 GSM. At $20,000, they added linen finish, and at $30,000, they bumped it up to 350 GSM. And those were the only stretch goals that were reached for the campaign. But even then, the $40,000 stretch goal and $50,000 stretch goal that weren't reached would have just made thicker booklets and a silk-style comic paper for the comic campaign. So again, not adding new content. If you follow the campaign prior to launch, or you pledged through the campaign rather than trying to say get it outside of the campaign sometime later, you got the Sanctum's Chosen hero, and then there was the Scribe hero, which was that social stretch goal at getting 100 followers on Kickstarter, 50 fans on Board Game Geek, 30 shares of a Facebook post, 50 likes of a post on Instagram, 10 likes of a post in Threads. Threads? What the heck is Threads? I said at the time. And 25 reposts on Twitter/X. But because there weren't a whole lot of stretch goals to speak of, we won't need to detail them here. We can dive right into the content itself. So this is a game where I definitely feel as though you really kind of need to see it on the table before I start explaining the components in order to make sense of what we're going to see. It'll make a lot more sense if you understand kind of the layout here. Every time you play, you're going to have a quest. The quest is going to have setup on one side, the name and other stuff like special rules and certain things that happen at certain points of the time track on the front. It may even be that instead of being a specific situation, it's actually an epic threat, sort of a superpower boss enemy that you're going up against. Running down the center, you'll have your Sanctum banner, and this is a game that essentially you can think of as using quadrants, basically. Quadrant, 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 quadrant. So think of this as running down the center, separating the left and right sides, where there'll be two quadrants, so to speak, on either side. So you have the Sanctum banner cards here. On either side of them, you'll have one hero. The heroes on either side will have a health value for each of them, but it's not treated as if they are separate heroes with separate health for the most part. Instead, it's like their health combines into the health of the Sanctum banner, and that's what's going to be the thing taking damage. So, for instance, here the Warlock has 6 health, the Pathbreaker has 8, so this Sanctum banner has 14 health. Any damage to either of them goes on the banner. That does mean that if your heroes move around, the number can change. Not the amount of damage that's on it, it's already there, but the maximum threshold before it's taken out does change if you move the characters, the heroes, around. To the upper area or lower area of your individual heroes, for each quadrant, you will typically have what's referred to as a proximity card. Something for this particular scenario that maybe gives you something, or is an extra hazard to deal with, perhaps. Typically only able to be interacted with by the hero that's next to it. You then also have the idea of battle lines. This is frequently compared to Space Hulk Death Angel because of the battle lines. I find this more deep, more engaging, and less punishing than Space Hulk Death Angel, but I can see why there's a comparison. There's, the sides of a line, I guess. So here, you have battle lines. So for example, if you have the Pathbreaker, their battle line is this area here. For the Assassin, it's here. Spirit Dancer, Warlock. So essentially going out the sides is where your battle line is. And that is typically who you are going to be able to attack and who can attack you as a particular hero. I say you in terms of the heroes. This is a solo game in its base mode. So for instance, here the Pathbreaker can attack the Demoniac or the Reanimation, and they can attack Pathbreaker, barring any special abilities. These are what's referred to as threats, and they come from a threat deck. Your individual heroes might also have loot. Each one can carry up to 2 pieces of loot. The way you do this normally, if you just have the base game, is you take the loot cards, which are found in this deck here, and simply place them underneath the card. The hero cards are wide enough to fit 2 loot underneath them. However, that's not terribly convenient when you're moving heroes around, so we'll see another way to deal with that if you happen to have some of the other content. Then down along the bottom, we have what's referred to as the stratagem cards. The idea here is that the different characters don't just have stuff that they can always do. You're not just picking actions from a list, and you can always do the same actions necessarily. The idea is that as a group, you're using a stratagem. So here, for instance, we have underestimated. Your stratagems will give you a set amount of action points for everyone to share for that round, though each can only typically do 1 action. Everybody has a little token with their symbol on it, with a blue side and a red side. The cards, the stratagem cards, as we will see here in a moment without the glare, have red and blue actions that can be taken. If you're going to take a red action, you flip to your red side, cover it up so nobody else can take that action, and the red ones cost 2 AP, whereas the blue ones cost 1. You don't have to spend all your action points, but you can't obviously spend more than it allows. The stratagems also typically have some kind of special ability to go with it to change up things for that particular round. You then have a quest tracker running along the bottom where you're tracking the time, what round it is, and the scout level. Every different region or location that you go to has a scout value, and when you get to that scout value, usually you're changing locations. Sometimes it's more just you have to hit that threshold for something to happen. It depends on the quest that you're playing. And then you have, as I mentioned, those region cards that gives you the region, the location that you're playing in, tells you how to set up those proximity cards, tells you what the scout value is, and at one point late every round, it'll flip over. and have something specific that happens each time it flips. It also tells you how many threats to spawn initially. That is another thing that's important with this before we move into looking at the actual components. When you're thinking of this layout, again, quadrants, essentially, as the layout. Everything chunked into quadrants. The proximity, the threats, the hero, it's quadrants all the way through. When you spawn threats, and in fact, when you do most everything in this game, you start here and you move clockwise. So if I'm spawning 2 threats, it's here and here. 1 threat, here. 3 threats. 1, 2, 3. And it's not that it picks up again where it left off the next time something happens. It always starts in this upper left corner, barring special game events. So you're always going to want your strongest fighters on the top row, which is not the case here with the Warlock, because they're the ones more likely to face mounting threats, mounting enemies piling up, whereas the Assassin will have less. But we will find that the different threats have different abilities, which include things like changing their location, which might be clockwise, counterclockwise, adjacent vertically, adjacent horizontally, so they can move. So it's not like you're safe if you're in this bottom left corner here, but it's a safer position than the top left there where Pathbreaker is right now. So, knowing all of that, having a sense of how this works and how it's all laid out, should hopefully help us make sense of all the components as we look at them for Heroes of the Sanctum. So let's take a look here at the core box as we start looking at this here. So we have Heroes of the Sanctum, the strategy card game, one of the characters, a unique quest-based strategy card game for solo adventures set in a dark post-apocalyptic fantasy universe. FireTap Games and their website. Title and company logo here. Title and company logo with the art carrying around. Title and company logo, all the same kind of stuff. And then the back will tell you a little bit about what to expect. So we have Heroes of the Sanctum, the strategy card game, images of some of the components, FireTap Games. You have the age warning there, duration 45 to 90 minutes. 1 player out of this box, ages 14 plus there also here. So you got the warning and you got that there. UPC, legalese, and then the text about it, which says, "The incursion has begun. Sacred tomes speak of a rift between our realm and the darkness, a time where ancient manifestations of the dark will force us all to the edge of extinction. It is foretold that the last of the Sanctum's champions will stand between the coming terrors and oblivion. That time has finally come to pass." Heroes of the Sanctum, the strategy card game, is a strategic quest-based solo adventure set in a dark, post-apocalyptic fantasy universe. That sounds familiar. You are called to assemble and control the actions of 4 uniquely skilled heroes. Journey through dangerously reactive environments. Interact with your surroundings and become more powerful by defeating threats, gaining loot, managing equipment, and activating your party. The destiny of all that remains has fallen to you. Will you answer the call? I would know, by the way, if you open the box, you have the title, company name, and website on the interior. So first, in the core box, we have 12 heroes normally, but again, there was that one for following the campaign or back in the campaign on Kickstarter, and the one that was a social stretch goal, both of which are only found, presumably, in the Kickstarter version of the game. I don't know if there's a retail version of it yet, but the Kickstarter version does include 2 specific extra heroes and comes with this card to explain what on earth it is you're seeing with those 2 extra heroes. It says, "This version of Heroes of the Sanctum, the strategy card game, includes 2 bonus heroes, the Scribe and the Sanctum's Chosen. They share the same hero icons as the Lightbringer and the Pathbreaker. When assembling your party, you cannot choose 2 heroes with the same hero icon. Thank you for supporting FireTap Games." And that is important. Remember, as I showed you, there's those little tokens that you put on top of the stratagem card when you're doing an action to indicate that the action has been taken by that hero. The way that this works is that when you go beyond the initial 12 different heroes, you wind up in a situation where they are reusing the icons up in the corner. So for example, Sanctum's Chosen and Pathbreaker have the same symbol there. Lightbringer and Scribe have the same symbol. So they could never be in the game together. It's kind of like, I think of in Nemesis, where you're doing the drafting and you're not supposed to use like 2 red characters or 2 purple characters if you're mixing them up from the different expansions. Kind of like that. And you will always be playing with 4 regardless. So, our main heroes here from the base game are the Warlock, Pathbreaker, Assassin, Spirit Dancer, Thunderhammer, Vision Seeker, Deflector, Infiltrator, Lightbringer, Powermancer, Marksman, Pyromage, and then the 2 that are exclusive that came from those sources I mentioned a moment ago, Sanctum's Chosen, and Scribe. Now just to look at one of these in detail, you have a health value up in the corner, you have an attack value here with the crossed blades, then you have a defense value. You then have their special symbol up here, a little thing that says hero, but there's their symbol to go on their little token and whatnot, their unique icon. They all have a passive ability of some kind, in this case, Shadow Bolt. Attack threats in any battle line. Apply +1 attack when attacking threats outside of this battle line. That's cool. Then unique Soul Siphon. Choose a threat in any battle line. That threat receives 2 damage. Then the Warlock may heal 2 damage. It's a flavor text underneath. Note though, unique abilities, unlike in many games, unique abilities aren't just things you can build up to and just kind of do. The stratagem cards will have an option to use your unique abilities, and when that comes up, you trigger it, but it's not something you can use otherwise. So the unique ability is meant to be sort of like an epic event that happens just every once in a while during the adventure. And then there's the possibility of upgrading your heroes to the advanced side here. So you notice here for the Warlock, it gives them 1 more attack, 1 more health, but their abilities in this case remain the same. And I chose the Warlock as the example here to show you what I mean by those custom heroes that you could have gotten for that highest pledge that I received as that gift for being the first backer. We're familiar with the Warlock now. Their abilities, what's on the card, advanced, all that good stuff. Let's take a look at my custom card. That is this. The way the custom cards work is you give it your own name, and they make art based on the images you provide. So there's me as the Truthcaster, which is a form of Warlock. Everything else remains the same. Flavor text, abilities, and all that. What does make this game a little bit different in terms of those custom cards, though, from something like Master of Wills or The Last Command, is that the custom cards are just for the person who got the custom cards. It's not included in every copy of the game because you've already got the regular version of it. Why get the custom version of it, I suppose. What's kind of cool, though, is they did send 3 copies. So you got 1 maybe to play with, 1 to tuck away, etc., just to kind of make sure that you don't wind up with yours getting destroyed at some point. That was very cool. We'll see that it actually comes with 1 other component, but that we'll see when we start looking at the multiplayer expansion. As mentioned before, you have a quest tracker to track the time and scouting level of a given region, and the other side is exactly the same. Then we have a total of 12 stratagem cards. They all have this card back here. So if you look here, these are separated out by how many action points you get to spend. So these 7 give you 8 action points. Everybody could do a red action if they wanted to because they all cost 2, blue costs 1. Then you got 4 that give you 7, so at least 1 is going to have to take a blue action even if everybody else takes a red. And then you have 1 that only gives you 6 action points, which means you're going to be having someone either not doing anything, or you'll have 2 people at least doing blue in order to allow the other 2 to do red. The way these work is that you have a title, you have your action points up here, it says stratagem, there's some narrative to it that you're supposed to read, and then some kind of special ability here. Before performing any hero actions, immediately move your heroes horizontally so they're on the opposite battle line. Then you have your symbols that are not always on every single card. These are the actions that you can take. So you have your attack action that you can use to go after threats, the one with the sort of axes there together. You could heal, typically just yourself, for 1 HP, which means healing your Sanctum banner by 1 HP. That's the little cross symbol there. You can defend, which means putting a defense token onto your hero, because usually it is only applicable to yourself again, and that basically prevents a damage coming in, but then it goes away. You have the taunt symbol that lets you move a threat from some other battle line to your battle line in case you want to engage them. You can move, which is just swapping places with any of the other 3 heroes. You can assist, which typically means that you're going over to somebody who is stunned and unstunning them. You have use, which allows you to basically use something on the board. It may be something like one of those proximity cards that has a use option. It may be something else. It kind of depends on the circumstances there. Then you got this symbol here, the little compass. That is how you scout. Okay, so many of your most important abilities here, right? Scout, heal, defend, and attack, they're all red. They all cost 2. But then your assist, use, move, and taunt all of those are 1 action point. And if you ever see one of a certain color with an X, that means you could use any one of the ones available for that color. Not just on the card, but all of them. And they have them nicely laid out here on the back of the rule book. You notice here what I was saying before about those unique actions that the heroes can take that only happen under certain circumstances? Here's an example. Underestimated. You may use the red X icons on this card to trigger a hero's unique action. So 2 of them could do unique actions for 2 action points if they wanted to off of this card. Another example would be extraordinary feats. You may spend all action points this round, all 8, to trigger the unique action of all heroes in play. This is the one that tends to come up most often and be most useful, at least in my playthroughs. You'll always start with it comes full circle at the top, basically, and at the end of the round in which you use it, that's when you shuffle everything else together and stick this on the bottom. So you don't even have to shuffle and really prepare the stratagem deck before the game. You just stick this one on top and go for it. Then you have a total of 18 region cards, which are basically where you are as things are happening. Again, we'll look at these in a moment as to what they have on them, but we did sort of look at that already when we looked at the layout of the play space. So again, the number in the bottom right is going to be green, and it's going to tell you, or at least it's going to be on a background of green, that's going to tell you what it takes to be fully scouted for this particular location. Remember, the maximum on the quest tracker is 11. So there are a total of 5 different locations that require you to go all the way to the end of the track. Riftway, Contaminated Sewer, Burning Village, the Catacombs, and Doom Rift. Then one that requires a scouting level of 8, the Iron Fort. Then we have a set of 6 that all have 6 as their scouting level, so about half the track, give or take. Forsaken Cliffs, Walls of the Sanctum, which is where you would start your first adventure. Rigged Dungeon, Path of the Vanguard, Underground Tunnels, and Lurkwood. Then you have 5 that have a scouting level of 4, Molten Lake, The Narrow Way, Fortified Cavern, Sacrificial Pit, and Undergate. And then 1 that has a scouting level actually of 0. But bear in mind, these are not things you're just going to randomly pull out, necessarily. There is a level of randomness, but only in the sense that you're doing what the quest card says to do during setup, and it might tell you to set up certain ones randomly, but it's not like you're using this entire pile all the time and pulling randomly from the pile. For example, there's one called Pathways into Doom that tells you to randomly choose 4 underground region cards with a difficulty level of 2. But you're not using all the cards, though it's still random from those specific cards. So what's up with the cards themselves? You have a difficulty level up here, 1, 2, or 3, region, and then it tells you a type, so that's where that keyword is, like underground. This tells you how many threats to spawn when you are initially entering the location, when you have arrived. When you have arrived, when you first get there may be some effects, in this case no effects. Updated tells you what happens when it flips to this side. There's a scout value, and there's the proximity cards to lay out and in which quadrants. And then what would happen is, when you get to the update part of the game, you flip it, and you do whatever updated says. And then the next time you get to that point of a round, you flip it again, and so on and so on. For what it's worth, these are the game phases. There's the hero phase, which is where you reveal and resolve the current stratagem, doing whatever the little yellow special effect text says. And you spend your action points to resolve the available actions, as we have seen. The threat phase we'll see in a moment when we look at the threats, but basically the threat phase is when the threats attack the heroes and apply damage and then perform their actions. The region phase is when you update the region. That's when you flip these region cards over to their other side, resolve any region keywords on proximities, and decide whether to leave if you're able. If you're fully scouted and there's other regions to go to, you can choose to leave at that point. Then you have the quest phase, where you resolve the quest objective and events, check if heroes have been defeated, and increment the time track if it's needed, if it's unmoved, and then activate threats, which really just means basically untapping them because they exhaust or turn sideways when they're doing their actions back in the threat phase. Then the game comes with 11 quest cards that you're going to be going through as sort of the primary focus of each game. So quest-wise, there are 7 that are sort of what you might call regular quests. You have 1 that's the introduction quest, the thing you're meant to do as you're just starting to learn the game. And then you have 3 that are epic threat quests, where basically the quest is to take out an epic threat, which is either the Dread Knight, the Soul Breaker, or the Hex Giver. Your introductory one is called Answering the Call. The other regular ones are Trapped in the Rift, Hold the Line, Raiders of the Fallen, Purge the Pit, Defend the Iron Fort, Pathways into Doom, and Contamination. Just using Trapped in the Rift as an example here, you're going to have the symbol up here just to let you know it's a quest. It says quest there, also has a title here. Has some type of specific information here, usually a win condition. Heroes are victorious when the Riftway is fully scouted, all heroes are advanced, and a hero is holding the unique relic in this case. Then the X there, that's again a time track thing. If X is 4, such and such. If X is 5, and so on. So you're checking the time track. This is happening at the end of the round during that quest phase. Then in this case, some other special information. If a hero is holding a unique relic and is not advanced, that hero becomes advanced. Shuffle unique relic into the top 4 loot cards. And then there's a little time symbol here. If the unique relic was just shuffled into the top of the loot deck, move the time token back by 3 to a minimum position of 1. And you got your flavor text there. But they all have different stuff that they do. And on the back, they have some setup here. So you've got some flavor text, difficulty level, and then tells you how to set up your region stack and any other special setup rules on each one. The epic threat ones also do that on the back, but they themselves are a threat that have an attack value and a health value. In this case, this epic threat cannot attack or be attacked until the Doom Rift is fully scouted. Heroes are victorious when the Dread Knight is defeated, and so on and so on. And one of these epic threats can attack any of the heroes, so you decide who they actually attack. There's no battle line because it's up at the top where the quest typically goes. So let's start looking at those tiny cards here. So we have the Sanctum banners, as I mentioned. They're the battle line core. They go in the center of a battle line. Again, a hero on either side with the battle lines going out from either side from there. They are identical. It's just basically some flavor text and whatnot, but this is where you're going to put damage that goes on the combined health of the two heroes in that particular row. The backside there is just the same. They're effectively identical all the way around. And then you have the standard bearer. You actually won't be using this in a solo game, which is what the core box supports. You will be using this in the multiplayer game, and it's just one of these things where the multiplayer package only came with regular size cards, so rather than putting this in the multiplayer package, they just went ahead and put it into the core box. But whoever has this is the standard bearer, which basically means they're the one, for example, that makes certain decisions. Like they're the one who decides what order the heroes go in when they're performing their actions during that phase. Then we have a total of 15 proximity cards that actually go up to the number 30, because they are double-sided with odd numbers on one side, even numbers on the other. So we have here on the odd number sides, Imperial Chest, Inconspicuous Barrel, Portcullis, Rope Bridge, Wooden Barricades, Dwarven Bear Trap, Tainted Crypt, Thief, The Tavern, Trader's Market, Training Grounds, Monastery of the Ascended, Temple of the Third Eye, Inferno times 2. And you notice here it's kind of a mixture of things. Some are like items, some are basic places, one's even an individual who might be nearby and so forth. So they all kind of differ in terms of thematically what they look like, but some of them do the same things. Like Imperial Chest and Inconspicuous Barrel effectively do the exact same thing. Training Grounds and Monastery of the Ascended effectively do the same thing, and the Infernos are actually identical. Then we flip them over, we get the even numbers on the other side. We have Wooden Crate and Buried Goods. Again, these do the exact same thing, not only as each other, but as their opposite sides there. It's basically just the nearest hero gains a loot and then you discard it. So it's just thematically different ways of having them do that without it constantly being a chest or constantly being a wooden crate. Then we have the Hidden Tunnels, the Watchtower, High Ground, Dwarven Mountain Cannon, the Bell Tower, Rope Trap, Ancient Olive Tree, Traveling Merchant, the Wise One, Cursed Remains, Dark Altar, and then on the back of the Infernos, thematically, are Embers, because typically those will flip over, and it's like the fire is dimming down a little bit, but then it can go back into a Raging Inferno again. So, for example, some of these do have some abilities that flip them over, that cause one side to affect the other, or thematically be connected, but not all of them. Then you have a total of 30 threat cards, but it is 2 copies each for all 15 of these individual threats here. They are divided up by difficulty level, again, very much like what we saw with those regions. So we have level 3, level 2, and level 1. As far as that goes, they all effectively work in a similar fashion. For level 3, we have 2 copies each of Death Knight, Overlord, Doom Witch, Earthbreaker, and Giant Arachnid. For level 2, it's Reaper, Underhound, Manipulator, Soulburner, Doomguard, Enraged Ghoul, and Forgotten Ones. And then for level 1, the Shade, Demoniac, and Reanimation. The setup section of a quest card will tell you which ones to use for a given quest, so you're not using them all in every game. So Death Knight's a good example for us to use here. It has a lot of stuff on it. That's the card back for the threats. So you have a difficulty level, as I said, the title, threat, and then there may be a special type or something as a keyword over here on the side that might be referenced by something else. An attack value and a health value here, so you need 3 damage on it to kill it. It attacks for 2. Then they may have a special ability. This threat cannot be expended by any hero action, so you can't use an action that causes it to expend, so it can't do anything during the threat phase. So during the threat phase, you're going to attack with all of them, again, starting in the top left and going clockwise around. And then you do the actions for the individual threats, which in this case is Dark Revival. If this threat has taken damage, it heals 1. Again, going around in the circle, in a loop. In this case, there's also a defeat ability. When defeated, the current hero gains 1 loot. And then there's some flavor text down there at the bottom. And you notice here that while this card has pretty much all the different pieces to it, not every card does. They all have a difficulty value, a name, it says threat, it gives them perhaps a keyword, an attack value, a defense value, and an action, even though in the case of Demoniac, the action is to do nothing. But not all of them have a defeat ability, not all of them have some kind of unique special ability. Then if you manage to get yourself some loot, then you've got your loot cards here, a total of 16 of these. You have 4 that are weapons, the Elven Lightblade, the Imperial Crossbow, the Berserker's Axe, and the Blade of the Cursed. You have 1 that is a special quest item. We actually saw this quest earlier, the Unique Relic. And there are 2 that are forms of armor. You have the Helm of the Undone, which is just considered armor, and the Imperial Shield, which has the keywords armor and Imperial, just in case that is referenced by something else. Then you have your consumables here. Linen Bandage, One-Shot Musket, Throwing Axe, Village Loaf, Dwarven Explosives, Sacrificial Elixir, Battered Shield, Scroll of Restoration, and Sanctified Water. One thing I would note is that a consumable, as it says, is something that gets discarded for something to happen. Discard this to receive. When this hero is about to receive damage, this may be discarded to. Discard this to, and so on. Aside from being their first backer, I was apparently the first person to spot a piece of errata that they have now put on BGG, which is the Linen Bandage. Choose a hero, that hero heals 2. Nothing about discarding, but it is a consumable. Yes, the Linen Bandage must get discarded. The backs, by the way, are this. So just to get a closer look at one of these before I tuck them all away, they have a title, they say loot, they have some type of keyword for their type, and some of them will just have an ability, some will say passive. Passive is just something that happens all the time, doesn't have to be activated or anything, and then some type of flavor text underneath. Now that's all the cards that are in the base game. Before we look at the tokens and the rulebooks and whatnot that are in there, I do want to note one quick thing about storage. You'll notice here that when you put all the regular size cards in and the mini size cards in, they're basically up to the divider in between. In fact, it's a little bit higher, just barely, for the items. And that's not even sleeving them. My suggestion to you, if you are going to store this game away once you get it, is get yourself a piece of cardstock. Cut it so the height is basically the height of the small stack of cards there. And then you have a cover that's about the width of the cards. And then just stick it in here when you store the cards away. That way, they're not going to slide around in here on top of anything. And when you put the rule books and stuff on top, that'll keep these cards from sliding around and keep this from sliding around. Then you have yourself a bunch of little teeny tiny tokens. And we are talking tiny. These are like smaller than a dime type tiny. Be careful with them so you don't lose them, especially the ones that only have 1 copy of that particular token. So you have your time and scouting tokens that are used to track it on that quest tracker. You have 4 defense tokens to indicate that a particular hero is defending. You can only ever have 1, so there's just 1 for each hero. But on the back, they also have the stunned icon in case that hero is stunned. Being stunned, by the way, is about the worst possible thing that can happen, because when you are stunned, it's not just a 1-round thing. Until somebody uses an assist action to help you, you are screwed. You can't do anything. If you see anything coming at you as a threat that has a stunned effect, kill it with fire quickly, or with something else. You get the idea. There's also 5 of these little quest tokens that certain quests will utilize. They have a sort of a dark brown or black side, and then a red side. Then you have your 12 tokens that are used to track actions with those hero images on them, little hero icons. Again, there are 12 of these. There are 14 if you got the Kickstarter version of the game, so you are going to be reusing 2 of these, which means no overlap for those characters, as I explained earlier. We will see the same thing when we look at the Epic expansion. All these, again, do have the red side to them in case you're doing a red action. Initially, I actually wondered why they would bother with the red and blue side thing, but you'll find it does come in very handy in counting how many action points you've actually spent. And then to track the health on the Sanctum banner for the 2 heroes on either side of it, and to track the health of threats that are not immediately killed, we have 33 of these damage tokens, 3 on one side, 1 on the other. Like many Fantasy Flight games, we have a how to play booklet, and then we also have a rules reference. So the how to play is basically setup, how to play overall, a little bit of frequently asked questions and whatnot there. The rules reference is not just a regular rules reference, though it's useful as a rule reference. This is also where you're going to find the breakdown of the card anatomy. So if that feels missing in the how to play booklet, it's in the rules reference. And they both, in case you need them, have that quick reference on the back about what the different actions are and the phases of the game. One thing I would note here, by the way, is that in the how to play booklet, there are difficulty modes for this. It's not as punishing as Space Hulk Death Angel, but it is pretty punishing at times. I do think this has more going on than Space Hulk Death Angel, even though it's often compared to it for whatever reason with, I guess, the battle line idea. Anyway, for the adventurer difficulty, which is sort of the easy mode, if you want to call it that, you have advancing 2 heroes at the start of the quest, so basically taking 2 heroes and turning them to their upgraded sides, and discarding 1 threat once you put them out. So if it tells you to put out 4, you put out 4, then pick 1 to get rid of. Champion lets you advance 1 hero, but that's it. And then the hero mode is the no changes mode. So essentially, if you're playing by the regular rules, you're basically playing hard difficulty. And that, folks, is the content of the base game of Heroes of the Sanctum, the strategy card game. Let's move on to the expansions, starting with the one that makes the most logical sense first, which is the multiplayer expansion. So as I said, this brings us to the multiplayer expansion. Heroes of the Sanctum, the strategy card game multiplayer expansion. The text there says, expand your adventures to support up to 4 players with all new multiplayer stratagems, skill sheets, action trackers, quests, and more. Requires Heroes of the Sanctum, the strategy card game core set. Company name and website. Again, the sides here just say the name of the game, and then the company on the short sides, with the long sides also having multiplayer expansion. The back again will give us a sense of what this is. Otherwise, it's pretty much laid out the same. Title of the expansion, some components, all that same kind of stuff down here. It does note that the core set is required in this little box here. And then what does it actually say about the expansion itself? In unity we stand. Quote, become united in life, undivided in death. There is none among us who stand alone against the darkness. The Sanctum of the Scribes. Heroes of the Sanctum, the strategy card game multiplayer expansion, empowers you to undertake quests cooperatively with up to 4 players. This expansion introduces new mechanisms and features for the hero phase to maximize multiplayer experiences, as well as 2 new quests. And there's a list of game content. Will you answer the call? Once again, if you look at the interior, once you take the lid off, it's title, company name, website, title, company name, website again. So this one, again, actually has 2 sets of rules with it. One's a rule book, one's a rule sheet. And this is actually part of why I would say, even if you're only going to play solo, you may want to go ahead and pick up the multiplayer expansion, because it's not just for multiplayer mode. It also includes what's called hybrid mode, where basically you can play solo using some of the components from this. I'll note which ones those are as we go along. In any event, the hybrid mode here is just a rule sheet. As I said, multiplayer is actually a booklet. It does have the reference there on the back with updated multiplayer game phases included here for that game form. First of all, what you'll find in there are some large cards. These are the so-called skill sheets for each hero from the base game. And yes, the Kickstarter version of this does come with these specifically for those 2 extra heroes as well. They let you know that again on a small card that just tells you what's going on. It doesn't come with the heroes themselves, but it does come with their skill sheets. So what the heck is a skill sheet? It's basically just a way to manage your character. When you're playing multiplayer, it's tough when everything's in the center of the table to constantly go up and read everybody's abilities or take care of putting loot underneath them and reading them while they're underneath the cards and all that. So instead, each player is going to have one of these skill sheets in front of them to go with their character, and the card on the table is basically just telling you, or the card that's up in the battle line is essentially just going to show you where they are positionally, if that's even a word, but everything else that you need will actually be on these cards. So for example, with our Warlock here, the symbol, the name, it says Core Skill Sheet, Health, Attack, Defense, Hero Skills, it has the passive and the unique, and the flavor text. All the same stuff we saw on the card, just bigger. There's art kind of shaded behind 2 slots. There are slots to put your loot in. So instead of sticking them underneath the card and having room for 2, here it's a little more explicit. You have 2 slots to put them in. And then if you ever advance, flip it over, there's the advance skill sheet on the other side. So everything that you would have, except for just the fact that it's in the position on the table, is represented here with a skill sheet. And this is actually what hybrid mode is. All that hybrid mode is that instead of playing with the regular setup where you have your loot cards underneath your heroes, you just have the hero cards out there doing their own thing, noting position, and you would still play with skill sheets for the individual heroes as a place to put the loot and organize them. But again, if you're playing solo, that means you got 4 of these in front of you, so they suggest this type of setup where you have the 4 just right in front of you before you get to the actual play space. And yes, thanks to their generosity of bumping me up from the Ultimate to the Custom pledge, having that custom Truthcaster hero card to actually stick out on the table also resulted in getting this. So multiple copies of this as well. We have the Truthcaster core skill sheet. Again, all they do is they switch out the name and switch out the artwork for an existing class that only goes to the person who backed it at that level, not included in every game because you already have the regular version, which again in this case is just the Warlock. You have 2 new quests included, both of which are epic threat kind of quests. We have Doombringer and Riftwalker. Now again, because everything at the center of the table is not necessarily within easy reach of every single player, you also have these new action trackers. So in multiplayer, each character, instead of placing their little action token onto the actual stratagem card, will instead be placing them on an action tracker in this case. We'll see how that works with stratagem cards for multiplayer in just a second. So this is what these cards look like here. It says Action Tracker Multiplayer. A little bit of flavor text down at the bottom, but basically just has the 4 regular red, the 4 regular blue, and a green X in the center that could be either blue or red. They are the same on either side, and they're all identical for the 4. Then you have the multiplayer stratagem cards, same stratagem card backs, same names generally speaking here, but to run through them, we have ones that give you 8 action points to spend collectively that are Sacred Retribution, Unimpeded, Extraordinary Feats, New Formation, Underestimated, It Comes Full Circle, and the Hymn of the Undone. Then 4 that give you 7 action points, Finders Keepers, Under Siege, Leadership, and Hostile Environment. And then 1 that gives you only 6, which is Restore the Line. But you notice these look a little bit different in what they do. So the idea here is they still have some action that happens, still has some special unique thing about that particular stratagem that takes effect, and some narrative. It is a multiplayer stratagem, not just stratagem up at the top, and it has these arrows with these colored backgrounds, and basically this is telling you the top left, top right, bottom left, bottom right heroes can do actions of the colors indicated. So basically what this is saying is that for this particular stratagem, while this is active, if you're the upper left or bottom right hero, you can only do blue actions. If you're the upper right or bottom left, you can do either. There are also some, like Leadership, where there are red only. So it's not having you put the tokens directly on them, but it is still giving you some type of extra layer of strategy to go with it, because now it's not just that everybody can do everything. You have to coordinate. So there you have it there, the multiplayer expansion. Again, mostly for multiplayer play, but if you do want to have those skill sheets, you could get those here and use hybrid mode to basically make managing a solo game a little easier on the table. We will find that the epic expansion that we look at next has taken care of that for you as well if you're using its heroes. That brings us to the last of the boxed expansions thus far, which is the epic expansion. My apologies if things seem to have shifted a little bit, if the lighting has changed. I'm recording this over multiple days, and this is actually the last piece that I'm recording just from a time perspective here. So what we have here is basically an expansion that you could call more of the same, but not in a bad way. It essentially expands your options for many of the things that we saw back in the base game, and a little bit of what we saw back in the multiplayer pack. So we have Heroes of the Sanctum Epic Expansion, an epic expansion, yeah, you just said that, of 33 additional loot cards, new heroes with multiplayer support, quests, regions, proximities, and all new companions. Again, requiring the base game to play, FireTap Games and their website. Again, a similar setup here. We have the name of the game, the name of the expansion, the company name on either of the long sides. On the ends, we've got just the name of the game and the company name with no name for this particular item. The back is also laid out in a similar fashion with the name of the game and expansion, some components, company logo, that same information here, UPC, legalese, core set required, and so on, and then a little bit about it. Support has arrived. As the incursion ravages our lands, we summon more champions to help step bravely into the fray. Let the memory of their sacrifice be eternal. The Sanctum of the Scribes. Heroes of the Sanctum, the strategy card game, epic expansion, includes 6 new powerful heroes, allowing players to quest with all new strategies. Also included are new quests, regions, proximities, loot, the all-new ability to recruit companions, and multiplayer support with skill sheets. Then game contents. Will you answer the call? The inner packaging, just the company name and website, name of the game and expansion, and the same thing on the other matching sides. So we have a rule sheet, just art on one side. The other side gives some new rules and components and whatnot here, but not really everything is covered. So it does list the components. You know what's in the box. In that case, everything is covered. There's a section on hero rules. That's what I've mentioned before about how if you have heroes that use the same symbol up in the corner, they can't be used in the same game. You have to use one or the other because you can't have ones of the same sort of class, type, whatever you want to call it, in the same game. There's new rules about loot, which basically just says to take all the loot cards for this game and just shuffle it with the rest. And then information about the companions that we'll be taking a look at here, which is considered a type of loot. But notice nowhere on here does it mention anything about the skill sheets and how to actually use those. Weirdly enough, you need the multiplayer expansion to have any information about what those skill sheets even are. So information about, how you sit them in front of you for hybrid mode or how each player uses it for multiplayer mode, not included at all with the Epic expansion. They just include the skill sheets for these new characters. So you might be sort of scratching your head if you skipped the multiplayer expansion. But that's what a video like this is for, right? So here are our 6 new heroes from the Epic expansion. We have the Berserker, the Enchantress, the Geomancer, the Hunter, the Pathfinder, and the Vanguard. For comparison here, the Berserker shares a symbol with the Assassin from the base game. Then Enchantress shares one with Deflector. Geomancer actually shares it with 2, both the Lightbringer and that Kickstarter exclusive Scribe. Then the Hunter shares it with the Marksman, the Pathfinder shares it with the Vision Seeker, and yes, the Vanguard is also one that shares with 2, just like the Geomancer. It shares the symbol with the Pathbreaker from the base game, and the Sanctum's Chosen, which was again a Kickstarter exclusive. And yes, they all have advanced sides on the back. Then, as I mentioned before, the package does include the skill sheets for these 6 new heroes, so you can use them for multiplayer or hybrid mode. Again, even though the Epic expansion doesn't actually tell you what to do with them. I am glad they included them, though. It would have been really easy to just leave them out and say, well, the Epic expansion isn't about multiplayer, so we just need the cards for the characters. I am glad they're there. And it's probably obvious I might not need to show it, but there you go. There are advanced versions, of course, on the other side. They're just, again, identical to the cards, except for the fact that, they're laid out a little bit differently to be able to be used in a more convenient fashion. Then aside from regular loot cards, this is the rest of what's in the box. I've sorted it out here, so instead of showing you one type of component at a time, I can show you how they kind of clump together. So there's 2 new quests. You have Protect the Child, which is just a regular quest, and Dread Fiend, which is one of those epic threat type quests here. And of course, because these things are in an expansion, they can maybe use stuff from the base game, but you couldn't have the base game using stuff from the expansion as a requirement. So what they've done is sort of sort of pigeonholed these, I guess you could say, sort of compartmentalized them, because Protect the Child and Dread Fiend both only require one region card, and the one region card for each is included in the expansion as either Unholy Labyrinth or Koldan Citadel. And again, with that same idea of we're going to keep everything in the expansion that's needed for a given quest, the proximities for each of these go beyond the number 30, which is what was in the base game, to go from 31 up to 46, giving us 4 tied into each. So for Unholy Labyrinth, you're going to use Demonic Doorway, there's 2 copies of that, and Manifesting Portal, also 2 copies of that. For Koldan Citadel, you're going to use 4 copies of Walls of Koldan. There's also a special loot card that is used specifically for Protect the Child, which is Brave Child. You got loot, character, quest item. The loot cards do all say Epic Expansion up here in the corner in a little bit of a banner here. Now you may notice here with the proximities, it's only the odd numbers listed there, but they all have even numbers on the back. So the Manifesting Portals become Demonic Portal, then your Demonic Doorway becomes a Dark Energy Cannon. The Walls of Koldan each become a so-called Dreadspawn Dominator. Basically what you're going to find happens here based on the rules of the individual quest is you're going to be using a lot of those quest tokens, those 5 quest tokens from back in the base game where it has a black side and a red side with that star on it, kind of an elder sign looking symbol on it like this. And basically different card effects and different effects of the regions and so forth, flipping and all that kind of stuff, is going to wind up placing those onto certain cards like the proximities on either the black side or the red side, and then depending on what side it's on, certain other card effects will do something with it because of that placement, like flipping over a proximity, for example. So they use the quest tokens in a way to essentially, again, keep this essentially self-contained as far as only needing these proximities, the one location for each of these quests. So I guess kind of nice that they're able to keep it self-contained there, so there's no unused components sitting around like in the base game that only actually get used here. Although I will note that we do have that standard bearer card back in the original game that is only used in multiplayer. So there is one instance of having a card that's kind of sitting there in the base game that wouldn't be used without an expansion, but otherwise not so much. Then finally, aside from that Brave Child that is technically a loot card, you have 32 other loot cards here. You have 4 that are orbs with different passive abilities: the Terror Orb, the Rejuvenation Orb, the Vision Orb, and the Inferno Orb. Only 1 weapon, which is the Rift Blade. You then have 3 pieces of armor, 2 of which are Imperial, which is the Imperial Greaves and Imperial Breastplate. Then the Defender Breastplate is just a regular armor. You have 3 new relics. They are considered consumables, but also relics. That is the Ancestral Skull, the Horn of Heroes, and the Tome of Advancement. Then you have some runes here. The runes all have reaction abilities, as do the gems. So we can look at all those at once. We have the Rune of Healing, Rune of Determination, Rune of Deflection, Rune of Expulsion, then the Gem of Protection, Gem of Dispersion, and Gem of Foreseeing. And then you have a few that are just sort of regular consumables: the Dwarven Bear Trap, the Glory Stone, Rejuvenation Stone, Sinister Throwing Knife, Tenacity Elixir, and Endurance Elixir. And then the rest are companions. That is the Wild Horse, the Axeman, the Trapped Soul, the Tribesman, the Shield Bearer, Spirit Owl, Pet Wolf, and Thief. Now these companions work a little bit differently than you might expect. I'm used to games like, I guess it's Arkham Horror 3rd Edition perhaps, where your companion is with you and they have sort of their separate health pool of their own. And they sort of do here, but sort of not. So basically what's going to happen with a companion, we'll just use the Trapped Soul here as an example, is if you get this as a loot, you'll put it on your character just like you would for any other loot. So it's one of the 2 that'll slip underneath, or if you're using the skill sheets, it'll go into one of those 2 slots. And they have an ability of some kind, in this case a use ability. When you have that use action, one of the blue actions that you put your token on and so forth, you'll get to do the use ability here. But the weird thing about it is that when you get hit for damage, when a particular hero gets hit for damage, and that damage goes onto the Sanctum banner, an equal amount of damage also goes on the companion. And when the companion hits a certain level, they must be sacrificed, meaning they get discarded. So when you take damage, they take damage. There is no thing where it sort of splits the damage where you can say, oh, I'm not taking damage, I'll put it on my companion. No, you just take the damage to the Sanctum banner and it goes on the companion. And then what'll happen though is that if you want to heal, you can't actually heal your companion. So if they've got 1 on it, you could take 1 away so it doesn't hit that 2 and wind up getting discarded. So works a little bit differently than what you might expect because of that sort of, it's not really a shared health pool so much as they're not a meat shield for you, basically. They can't step in front of you and take the damage instead of you. They're taking damage with you. I guess they're just standing too freaking close. So yes, the Epic expansion does add some nice variety to the game. You got some new heroes, you got some new loot, you got a couple of new quests with all the stuff you need for them. What's not to like? Then finally we have the comic campaign, which is pretty cool here. It says, Heroes of the Sanctum, the strategy card game comic campaign. It does say that you need to have the base game to play it, because obviously you can't play the game's comic campaign without the game. Company name and website here. The spine has the name there of the game without the strategy card game. Just Heroes of the Sanctum comic campaign. The back has a list of traits that we'll take a look at here momentarily. Pyro, Shield, Synergist, and so on. And it really is a comic-based campaign. So the idea is you read some introductory comic stuff, and then you get into the actual quests. So each quest will have information up at the top that sort of leads you into it. Setup information, information about victory and defeat, and what to do if you can't recruit 4 heroes, which we'll see about in just a second. And then typically some type of narrative ending here, where you go straight to specific ones and it tells you where to go. And so on through all of these until you get to the endings, right? So you have 7 total quests, and then endings. Based on what's going on, it'll tell you where to look, and there's an FAQ in the back. So the idea is with this that you're going to start by picking 12 different heroes to be your hero pool, and when you start a quest, you have to be able to pull 4 to start that quest. If an entire Sanctum banner gets down to 0 health, so both heroes on either side of it die, they're just gone from the game even if you win the quest. And then of course if you fail the quest, that's because all 4 of them have died. And the idea is they get removed from your hero pool. You might get yourself a bonus consumable as some type of reward, in which case you look through the loot deck, you grab the first consumable that comes up, you set it aside, and the next quest that you play, you get to have that consumable immediately with one of your heroes. You might also get given a trait, and the traits are here on the back, and typically it's something that is beneficial versus something that is negative, depending on which ones you wind up getting throughout the game. For instance, Pyro Shield. The nearest hero may freely use an Inferno/Ember's proximity after a defend action. Pyrophobic. To use an Inferno/Ember's proximity is now considered to be a red action and costs 2 action points instead of 1. They all have a little bit of flavor text underneath, but you notice they're in pairs here essentially. There's a good version and a negative version depending on what you've done throughout the game. There's also a legendary difficulty mode, or legend difficulty mode, that's even crazier, where your hero pool starts with 8 instead of 12. You can't do bonus consumables if you are awarded any, and you start with the despised status right here. At the start of each quest, replace a level 1 or 2 threat with a random level 3 threat, then reset the threat deck. Ouch. So just a cool little way to be able to play a campaign of linked games with Heroes of the Sanctum. Pretty neat here, and I like the fact that it has that narrative tissue in between in comic form. In that sense, it reminds me of Doomed Run for Set a Watch, though I feel as though the comic campaign here does provide a little bit more narrative background to it. And there you have it, folks. Everything for Heroes of the Sanctum, the strategy card game from FireTap Games. Again, a second Kickstarter is coming soon where you'll be able to get the old stuff plus a second wave of new content. This is the stuff all from that first Kickstarter. Again, I was a backer of this, so I will say this is not something where I was gifted the actual product to show. No need for a disclaimer there, but I will note, as I said before, they did thank me for being their first backer ever by bumping me up to the custom pledge level. That may influence my opinion, but I don't think it does. I think it's just a really fun, enjoyable game, and as someone who enjoys something like Space Hulk Death Angel, but always wanted a little bit more to it, and for it to be a little more forgiving and story-oriented, I think Heroes of the Sanctum really hits the spot with that. So we'll be back when checking out the second wave of content for Heroes of the Sanctum, because I'm sure I'm going to back that as well. Thanks for watching.